So my name is Rob Caskie. I'm a professional storyteller and speaker, doing so now for 25 years and love my job. So my background really into storytelling is quite an interesting story in my opinion. I studied agriculture at the University of Natal in Pietermaritzburg. And whilst I was there, I did a lot of traveling into various parts of Africa on motorbikes. And whenever I came back, there was always a group of people who wanted to hear what had happened on the bike. I think a lot of my colleagues thought I was a little bit crazy, some of the risks I took, especially traveling alone. But circumstances and particularly finances dictated that that was how I traveled. And when I came back from trips, there was always a group of people who wanted to hear what had happened on the bike. So we started telling stories in the little canteen, and folks would have their lunch, and I would just in a very informal setting tell them what had happened on the bike. I did not know at the time that I was developing in their mind the reputation of telling a reasonable story. And one of the folks who I didn't know at university, who used to listen to those stories, became curator of the Rorke's Museum on the Anglo-Zulu War battlefields. Now at the time they were made famous around the world by a great doyen of South African storytelling, David Rattray, who sadly was murdered in January of 2007. And David mentioned to the curator that he was looking for someone to help tell the stories on the battlefields. And the curator obviously over a couple of days gave it some thought and remembered me, my stories about motorbike trips and so forth. And he said to David, look, I don't know where this guy Rob Caskie is now, I don't know what he's doing, and I don't know if he's interested. But if he is, I think you could teach him the history. So it was a quite fortuitous, circumstantial introduction by the curator of the Rorke's Museum, who I didn't know well, who listened to my stories at university 11, 12 and 13 years earlier, who introduced me, quite by chance, to the late David Rattray with the idea of telling stories on the Anglo-Zulu War battlefields. And that really is how this incredible journey, a 180-degree change in my career path, began really in my mid-30s in the year 2000. Well, so my initial storytelling was exclusively on the battlefields at Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift. That very quickly developed into doing some very small basic trips to the UK to tell stories in the United Kingdom. And then of course with David's death in 2007, it changed exponentially because suddenly there was this huge gap and vacuum in the market, which I in some way tried to fill. But I really wanted to branch out and tell other stories and get into other historical matters. So I began to research early Arctic and Antarctic exploration with a view to getting onto the ships, to going to those areas, the west coast of Canada and Alaska, the mighty Iditarod sled dog race, the building of the Alaskan-Canadian highway, and it's been quite an evolution over the last 20 years or so to get to the point now where I speak on many different subjects and travel widely doing so, which I love. The best part of what I do is undoubtedly the way these stories engage and move audiences. And I've always thought in terms of life, work, and a legacy, the idea of being able to move people positively and change their thought processes around matters in history through storytelling is a wonderful vocation. I think in terms of the hard part about this job, it is very tiring. I've never got tired of storytelling, but the research and the telling of stories is very demanding. It's a bit like being a one-man show. But I think in it all, I've been reminded, having done this now for 25 years, that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for very good reason. And if I am ever approached by young people wanting to get into a career of storytelling and professional speaking, or if youngsters ask me for advice, I always tell them to use their transmitters far less than their receivers, to listen more than they speak. And it comes up often, this idea of predatory listening, where people are always waiting to interject, waiting to add something more important, waiting to interrupt you for want of a gentler term, as opposed to listening intently and really taking in from a conversation that they stand to glean a great deal from. In my experience and my opinion thus far, I think that good storytelling emanates from a story that becomes memorable. I tell stories about human beings rather than telling stories about history. And having said that, I feel that a good story, the opening is very important because it creates in the mind of the audience and the listener the desire or not to engage and listen to you. And that's important. How you hook people in right at the start. Make it clear to them that you are human, you're fallible, you can make mistakes, and that you hope that they are going to enjoy what you're going to present. The middle of a story is perhaps less important than the ending. The ending of a story is absolutely crucial because when the audience stand up and leave a storytelling venue, what they remember you for is your finish and how you finished. And in all that, I feel that a good story needs a spine and ribs or subtangents. And to be able to move off on a subtangent, a rib, good storytellers can do it for 12, 15, 20 minutes and bring the audience right back to the point they left them at. But they've been carried away in a wonder world of their own imagination for 15 or 20 minutes. And if you don't bring them back to the point you left them at, they're left wondering and hanging. And it diffuses the rest of your story because they are now beginning to wonder if you as the storyteller have lost your way. I've always felt that a good story is like a good piece of music. It needs cadence and repetition and volume, drama and pause. But volume in its own right does not create drama. And there are too many people who forget that. Audiences don't like being shouted at. Secondly, if a note is not striking a chord with the audience, changing its volume or its cadence is not going to change the result. You need to move away from that note and pick up on something else to engage the audience. And somewhere in all that, with a beginning, a middle, and an end, trying to craft a story like a good piece of music and having a reservoir of other anecdotes and stories that you can pull in, and central to it all, telling human stories that men, women, and children alike can relate to. I think somewhere in all that lies the recipe really for good storytelling. Well, I would say in terms of practical advice to develop and tell a story is, first thing, you need to know your subject well, research your subject well, that you're intimately familiar with it, and don't need to think too hard about the information you are sharing. And then I think it's very important that you establish with your audience a rapport and certainly eye contact with them. I think it would be fair to mention that these sticks in the background, I've been collecting sticks since I was a child. My father had some sticks before he passed away, which I inherited with great pride, and I expanded the collection since. But in Nguni culture, Nguni people always like to walk with a stick and a stick for defense with their family on their left, that they can defend themselves against undesirable people or animals. And more importantly, in their culture, if they have an important ndaba or mbizo, they have a talking stick. And you may only speak when you're in possession of the stick. And I think that this principle would work very well in Houses of Commons and Houses of Lords and governments around the world still today. As a result, I've never told a story in history without a stick. It's part of my logo. I am recognized by many of my guests for always having a stick. They bump into me at the airport and say, "Rob, where's your stick?" I have sticks that separate into two pieces so they're easy to pack into a bag for travel purposes. And my sticks provide me with a great deal of enjoyment, matters to speak about, and indeed something to carry and do with my hands when I'm in front of an audience. A lot of folks are nervous and it becomes fidgeting, or they put their hands in their pockets, which is an absolute no-no in front of an audience. It gives an air of indifference, perhaps of boredom, or the idea that you might rather be somewhere else. And a stick provides a fantastic prop. You can use it as a river, as a border, as a window frame, as a door, as a rifle, as a club, as a shield. And so a stick has become absolutely central to my storytelling. And I might put it down on stage and only pick it up for 5 minutes in a 60-minute session. But the fact that it's there is my safety blanket and an integral part of my branding and who I am as a white storyteller emanating really from the land of the Zulus in KwaZulu-Natal.